Every Christmas, my uncle insisted on taking the exact same family photograph. Same front porch, same old Pentax camera, same wooden tripod. Same place for every person. If someone stood a few inches out of position, he'd quietly stop everyone, move us back where we belonged, and begin again. As kids, we joked that he cared more about that photograph than Christmas itself. He never laughed. He'd simply look through the viewfinder one more time, make one last tiny adjustment, and press the shutter. One picture. Never two. Never three. If someone blinked, we'd have to wait until next Christmas. At the time, we thought it was just another one of Uncle Robert's harmless quirks. After he died, I discovered we'd misunderstood that tradition for almost 30 years. It had never been about preserving family memories. He was documenting something none of us had even noticed. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 36 when Robert passed away. Like most families, ours had its own traditions. An aunt who baked the same pie every year. A grandfather who insisted on reading the Christmas story before dinner. Someone always burned the rolls. For us, it was Uncle Robert and his camera. No presents were opened until the photograph was finished. No exceptions. It didn't matter if children were crying or dinner was getting cold. The picture came first. Looking back, that alone should have told us how important it was to him. Robert wasn't a professional photographer. In fact, he barely touched a camera during the rest of the year. The old Pentax lived inside the same worn leather case from the late 80s until the day he died. When digital cameras became popular, everyone offered to replace it. He always smiled and shook his head. This one already knows where to stand. Nobody understood what he meant. We assumed it was another one of his strange jokes. Years later, I realized it wasn't a joke at all. Robert had spent almost 40 years working as a civil engineer. Bridges, retaining walls, road foundations, the kind of structures people never notice unless something goes wrong. He approached everything the same way. Quietly, patiently. He rarely guessed. If he made a statement, he'd measured it first. Sometimes literally. He carried a small notebook everywhere. If we stopped for ice cream, he'd somehow end up measuring the width of a crack in the sidewalk. If we visited relatives, he'd study the slope of the driveway before walking inside. My father loved teasing him. Checking if the house moved, Robert would smile without looking up. You'd be surprised. Everyone laughed. Robert never did. The earliest Christmas picture I clearly remember was from 1996. I was 8 years old, standing between my parents on the front porch. Grandpa wore the same green cardigan he seemed to own forever. Grandma smiled at someone off to the side. My cousin Josh started making a goofy face just before Robert counted to 3. Josh, he lowered the camera. Straight ahead. Josh groaned dramatically. I am looking straight ahead. No. Robert walked all the way across the yard, gently turned Josh's shoulders a few degrees, stepped back to the tripod, and looked through the viewfinder again. Then he looked at me. Daniel. 1 step forward. I moved. Half a step. There. Only then did he take the picture. 1 click. 1 photograph. As children, we thought he was obsessed with perfection. Now I know perfection was never the goal. Consistency was. Every few Christmases, Robert would disappear outside an hour before everyone else arrived. Once I followed him. He wasn't decorating. He wasn't clearing snow. He had a tape measure stretched across the yard. He measured from the porch to the tripod, then from the tripod to the mailbox, then to the old maple tree near the driveway. He wrote every number into his notebook before putting everything away. "What are you doing?" I asked. He smiled. "Making sure nothing important has changed." I looked around. Everything looked exactly the same. "The house isn't going anywhere." I know. His eyes drifted toward the edge of the property for just a moment. "I'm not measuring the house." At the time, I didn't ask what he meant. I wish I had. When Grandpa died in 2008, everyone assumed the tradition would finally end. My mother suggested taking future Christmas pictures at Aunt Susan's house instead. Robert answered before anyone else could speak. "No, we take it here. But Dad's gone." "I know. We still take it here. There wasn't a single argument after that. For the first time in our lives, Christmas dinner happened somewhere else. Yet before anyone opened presents or sat at the table, the entire family drove across town just to stand on the empty front porch for one photograph. It seemed completely normal, because Robert said it was. After Grandma passed away 5 years later, developers started making offers on the property. It overlooked the river, and the land alone was worth a fortune. Everyone expected Aunt Susan to sell. She never did. Whenever someone asked why, she'd always give the same answer. Robert told me not to. That was it. No explanation. Just complete confidence that he had his reasons. I didn't understand that either. Not until 3 days after his funeral, when Aunt Susan handed me 28 photo albums. "You're the only one who'll appreciate these." That evening, I spread every Christmas photograph across my living room floor in chronological order. At first, I saw what everyone sees: children growing up, parents growing older, grandparents disappearing, new babies, new spouses, dogs that came and went, 28 years of ordinary family life. Then my friend Nathan stopped by to return a ladder he'd borrowed. He looked at the photographs for less than a minute before pointing at the oldest one. "You know what's incredible?" "What?" "The camera never moved." I laughed. "That sounds exactly like Uncle Robert." Nathan slowly shook his head. "No, you don't understand." He picked up the oldest photograph and laid it beside the newest. "This isn't close. It's exact." And that was the moment everything changed. Nathan carried the 2 photographs to my kitchen table and opened an image overlay app on his phone. "What are you doing?" "Something your uncle would have appreciated." He carefully aligned the porch columns in both pictures, then the front door, the roof line, the chimney. When everything matched, he slowly faded one image over the other. At first, nothing looked unusual. The house lined up perfectly, the porch, the windows, even the old maple tree. Then Nathan pointed toward the edge of the frame. "Look at the retaining wall." I frowned. "It doesn't line up." "It should." He adjusted the images again. Now the difference was impossible to ignore. The wall had shifted, not much, maybe an inch over nearly 3 decades, but only the wall. Everything else remained perfectly aligned. If the camera had moved, Nathan explained, the entire photograph would shift. Instead, only one structure changed position. I stared at the screen. Stone walls aren't supposed to move. They're definitely not supposed to move like this. The following morning, I drove to my Aunt Susan's house. The porch looked exactly as I remembered. Same white railing, same rocking chairs. Even the nail where Robert always hung the camera bag was still driven into the porch beam. I walked across the yard to the spot where he'd always placed the tripod. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then sunlight caught something in the grass. A small brass disc, barely larger than a quarter. I brushed away the dirt covering it. Stamped into the metal were 3 words: "Camera position." My heartbeat quickened. Robert hadn't been estimating where to stand. He'd permanently marked the location. "Aunt Susan?" She stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "What are you looking at?" I pointed toward the brass marker. "Did you know this was here?" She smiled. "Oh, that. Robert installed it years ago." "You knew?" "Of course." "What did he say it was for?" She thought for a moment. "He called it his control point." That sounded exactly like something Robert would say. "What does that mean?" "He told me if the camera ever moved, the photographs would become useless." I looked back at the tiny brass marker. "Did he ever explain why?" Her smile slowly disappeared. "No. But he did tell me something a few years before he died." "What?" "If anyone ever asks why I kept taking those pictures, tell them to compare the wall. Not the family, not the house, the wall." That afternoon, I carried every album into my office. As an architect, I had access to software designed to compare buildings photographed years apart. If Robert had spent 28 years creating identical images, I wanted to know exactly what he'd been seeing. I scanned every photograph at high resolution. Then I spent nearly 3 hours aligning them. Porch columns, window frames, roof edges, the chimney. Everything had to match perfectly. Finally, I clicked through the images one by one. The family flickered in and out of existence. Children became adults. Grandparents disappeared. Christmas decorations changed. Snow came and went. But the retaining wall slowly drifted toward the house. The movement was almost invisible from one year to the next. Less than a quarter inch most years. But over 28 Christmases, it had moved nearly 9 inches. I leaned back from the monitor. Robert hadn't imagined it. He'd measured it. One photograph at a time. Before sunset, I returned to the property. This time, I walked straight to the retaining wall instead of the porch. It stretched almost 80 feet along the front of the yard, holding back the hillside above the river. At first glance, it looked solid, strong. Exactly the kind of wall that should last another 50 years. Then I looked closer. Hairline cracks separated the mortar in several places. A few stones had clearly been repaired with newer material. Near the center, someone had filled tiny drilled holes with epoxy. None of the repairs looked recent. They'd been made over many years, not rebuilding the wall, simply keeping it alive. When I asked Aunt Susan if Robert had ever worked on it, she nodded immediately. Every spring. Every spring? He'd bring a bucket of mortar and spend the weekend repairing little sections. I thought he just enjoyed working with stone. She looked toward the wall. Now I'm not so sure. Neither was I. By then, one thing had become obvious. Uncle Robert hadn't spent 28 Christmases protecting a family tradition. He'd spent 28 Christmases documenting a problem that nobody else seemed willing to notice. The next morning I drove to the county library. Not for books, for newspapers. Small-town newspapers have a habit of remembering things everyone else forgets. An elderly librarian helped me load decades of local archives onto a microfilm reader. I searched the property's address first. Nothing. Then River Road. Then the retaining wall. Almost an hour later, I found a short article from November 1993. The headline wasn't dramatic. County engineers inspect Riverside retaining wall. Heavy rainfall had caused minor movement along the hillside overlooking the river. County engineers concluded there was no immediate danger, but recommended continued monitoring. I checked the date again. November 1993. The very first Christmas photograph Robert ever took was 1 month later. That couldn't be a coincidence. I kept searching. Another small article appeared 2 years later. Additional monitoring planned for Riverside Slope. Again, there was no mention of an emergency, only inspections, measurements, routine observations. Then, nothing. After 1996, every article simply stopped. No final report. No announcement that the problem had been solved. Just silence. It was as if someone had quietly decided the hillside no longer deserved attention. Yet Robert kept taking the same photograph for another 23 years. On the drive home, I called my father. "Dad, do you remember why Uncle Robert started taking those Christmas pictures?" He laughed softly. "I always thought your grandmother wanted better family photos. So nobody really knew?" "Oh, we asked him plenty of times." "What did he say?" "He'd smile and tell us, 'Give me another 20 years.' 20 years. Not next year, not someday. 20 years. Almost as if he already knew whatever he was watching would change so slowly that most people would never notice it. That afternoon, I returned to my office and compared the newspaper articles with Robert's photographs. The timeline matched almost perfectly. Inspection, tiny movement. Another fraction. Another. The retaining wall hadn't suddenly become unstable. It had been creeping downhill one Christmas at a time. Then something else caught my eye. Behind the retaining wall, almost hidden among the trees, stood the same weathered wooden stake in every single photograph. I'd ignored it because it blended into the background. I opened the oldest image. Then the newest. The stake hadn't moved at all. Not even a fraction of an inch. The wall had. I suddenly realized Robert hadn't been comparing the wall to the porch. He'd been comparing it to that stake, the family, the house. Even the porch, they were only there to make sure the camera never changed position. The real measurement was happening between one fixed point and one slowly moving wall. The next morning, I returned to Aunt Susan's house carrying Robert's oldest photo album. This time, I wasn't there to look at old pictures. I wanted to recreate one. The brass marker labeled Camera Position A was still buried in the grass. I brushed away the dirt, set my tripod directly over it, and opened the oldest photograph beside the camera. Robert had left tiny handwritten notes on the back. Tripod, 54 inches. Lens, 50 millimeters. Center on chimney edge. Every detail had been recorded. Not because he loved photography, because measurements are only useful when every condition stays the same. It took nearly 40 minutes to match the original framing. When I finally looked through the viewfinder, the scene felt strangely familiar. The porch, the railing, the maple tree, the retaining wall. Everything appeared exactly where it should, except the wall. Even without comparing photographs, I could tell it sat slightly farther forward than it had in 1993. Robert hadn't needed fancy equipment. He built his own long-term measuring system using nothing more than a camera, a tripod, and extraordinary patience. That afternoon, I called the county engineering department. After being transferred several times, I finally reached an engineer named Steve Collins. "I've got a strange question." "I've heard stranger." "I'm looking into the retaining wall on River Road." There was a brief pause. "The Mercer property? You know it?" "I know the wall." That answer caught me completely off guard. "You've inspected it?" "No. My predecessor did." "Do you still have the reports?" "I'll have to check." He called back 2 hours later. "I found something." "What?" "There were annual inspections for several years. And then? They stopped." "Why?" "I honestly don't know. The file just ends. No final report. No closure. No explanation." I stared at Robert's albums spread across my desk. The county had stopped watching the wall decades earlier. Uncle Robert never had. And for the first time, I wondered if the reason he'd never explained the photographs to anyone wasn't because they wouldn't understand. It was because he no longer trusted anyone else to keep watching. 3 days later, Steve called again. "I found someone you need to meet." "Who?" "The engineer who originally inspected that hillside. I thought he'd retired years ago." "He did. So why call him now?" Steve laughed quietly. "Because when I mentioned your uncle's photographs, he said he'd been waiting 20 years for someone to bring them. His name was Walter Brennan, 82 years old, retired geotechnical engineer. He lived alone in a small brick house overlooking the same river that ran below my aunt's property. When I knocked, he opened the door before I could knock a second time." "You brought them." He wasn't asking. I held up one of Robert's albums. "I did." Walter smiled. So Robert kept his promise. His living room looked more like an engineering archive than a home. Rolled survey maps filled one corner. Shelves overflowed with geology textbooks and old inspection reports. Framed aerial photographs of the river valley covered one wall. Walter cleared space on the dining table and gently placed Robert's album in front of him. For a long moment he didn't open it. He simply rested one hand on the cover. "He never missed a Christmas." "No, I don't think he ever intended to." Walter nodded slowly. "Neither did I." I frowned. "You knew why he was taking these pictures?" "I did more than know." He looked up at me. I suggested the idea. Back in 1993, Walter had been the county's senior geotechnical engineer. After several weeks of unusually heavy rain, residents began reporting small changes around the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic. A sidewalk developed a thin crack. One mailbox leaned slightly downhill. The retaining wall on River Road bulged outward by less than an inch. "We knew the hillside was moving," Walter said. "The problem was proving how fast." Survey equipment at the time wasn't accurate enough to detect tiny annual changes with complete confidence. Every new survey introduced small measurement errors. We needed a permanent visual record. "So Robert suggested the photographs." Walter smiled. "Exactly. At first everyone thought the idea sounded ridiculous. Take one photograph, from the exact same location, on the same day every year." Walter admitted he laughed the first time Robert explained it. He told me Christmas was perfect. "Why Christmas?" "Because the whole family would already be there." no one would question another family photo. And if the camera never moved, neither would the evidence. Walter leaned back in his chair. I honestly believed we'd only need 5 years. What happened? Robert smiled and said, "Then I'll keep taking them until you tell me to stop." "But the inspection stopped," I said. Walter's expression changed immediately. "They did." "Why?" "Officially." He gave a tired smile. "Budget cuts." "And unofficially, the county hired a consulting firm. They inspected the slope once, declared everything stable, and recommended no further monitoring. Case closed." "You disagreed." "I absolutely disagreed." "So what did you do?" "I kept measuring, and Robert kept taking photographs." Walter opened the album. Together we slowly turned the pages. The movement was almost impossible to notice. By 2005 it became easier. By 2012, the center of the wall had shifted several inches. By the most recent photograph, there was no denying it. Walter pointed quietly at the images. "See how the movement accelerates after long periods of heavy rainfall?" I nodded. "I never would have noticed that." Robert did. He disappeared into another room and returned carrying a large cardboard tube. Inside were original engineering drawings from the early 1950s. The retaining wall sat along the edge of the property exactly as it does today, but beneath it, someone had drawn dozens of narrow horizontal passages running through the hillside. "What are these?" Walter spread the plans across the table. "Drainage galleries. I've never heard of them. Most people haven't. They were small tunnels built inside the hill to carry groundwater safely toward the river." He tapped one section with his finger. "They kept the entire slope stable." "What happened to them?" Walter looked at me for several seconds before answering. "They were abandoned." Then he quietly added, "And that's when your uncle realized the wall was only the symptom. The real problem was hidden underneath." Walter rolled the drawings back up and placed them beside Robert's photo album. "For years, those drainage galleries carried groundwater away from the hillside," he said. "As long as they stayed open, the retaining wall barely had to work. So why were they abandoned?" "They were expensive to maintain." He gave a tired smile. "When budgets get tight, people always cut the things nobody can see." The answer sounded painfully familiar. Road foundations, storm drains, bridges. Most infrastructure is ignored until something fails. Robert understood that better than anyone. Walter handed me another folder. Inside were copies of inspection reports from the early 90s. Most ended with the same recommendation: continue annual monitoring. Then the paperwork suddenly changed. A consulting company hired by the county declared the hillside stable and recommended ending the inspections altogether. One signature closed the file. Just like that. The county stopped measuring. Robert didn't. He came to see me a week after that report. Walter said quietly, "What did he say?" "He told me he didn't believe the numbers." "You trusted him?" Walter smiled. "I trusted the man who measured everything twice. I thought about the Christmas photographs spread across my office floor. For almost 30 years, everyone in my family believed Robert was preserving memories. In reality, he had quietly continued the work the county abandoned. Not because anyone asked him to, because he believed someone had to. He never expected to prove the wall was moving in 1 year," Walter continued. "He was thinking decades ahead. He knew one photograph meant nothing. But 30, Walter gently tapped the album. "That becomes evidence." Before I left, Walter stopped me at the front door. "There's one thing Robert never told you." I turned back. "He and I made a promise." "What kind of promise?" "If either of us died before the hillside was fixed, the other would keep watching." I frowned. "So after you retired, he kept the promise alone." Walter looked toward the river outside his window. "I offered to help more than once. He always told me the same thing. I'll handle Christmas. You keep arguing with the county." For the first time since his funeral, I laughed. That sounded exactly like Uncle Robert. The next morning, I opened the final photo album again. This time I looked at the backs of the photographs instead of the fronts. Every print carried Robert's neat handwriting. Date, temperature, film type, weather conditions. Nothing unusual until 2007. On the back of that year's photograph, he'd written one extra sentence. Movement accelerating after heavy spring rain. The following year there was another. County still hasn't returned my calls. Then another. Repaired south joints myself. No official inspection. Every year after that, the notes grew longer. They no longer read like photography records. They read like a field journal. Robert hadn't simply noticed the movement. He'd reported it, documented it, repaired what little he could himself. And when nobody listened, he kept collecting evidence anyway. That afternoon, Aunt Susan called. I found something else while cleaning Robert's workshop. An hour later, she handed me a small metal box I'd never seen before. Inside were three things: Robert's old light meter, a folded county survey map, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, in his handwriting, were 7 words. Open only after comparing every photograph. I smiled despite myself. Even after his death, Uncle Robert was still making sure I followed the process. Inside was a 4-page letter. It began with one sentence. Daniel, if you're reading this, you finally stopped looking at the family. I already felt a lump in my throat. He'd known this day would come. He'd known someone would eventually notice what he'd spent nearly 3 decades trying to preserve. As I turned to the second page, I realized something. The photographs were only the beginning. Robert had left me one final piece of the investigation. Daniel, if you're reading this, then you finally looked past the family. Good. That means you noticed what I hoped someone eventually would. The photographs were never meant to prove the wall was moving. The county already knew that. The real question was whether it had ever stopped. Around 2004, the official reports claimed the movement had stabilized. My photographs said otherwise. Every Christmas the wall crept a little closer to the house. Not much. Just enough that no one would notice unless every picture was taken from exactly the same place. That's why the camera mattered. Not because I loved photography. Because photographs don't change their minds. Robert went on to explain that he had reported his measurements several times. Sometimes to the county. Sometimes to consulting engineers. Sometimes directly to officials. Most thanked him. A few promised to investigate. Nothing ever happened. Eventually, he stopped trying to convince people with words. Instead, he let the photographs continue speaking for him. 1 year at a time. 1 Christmas at a time. Near the end of the letter, he wrote something that stayed with me long after I finished reading. Lawyers argue. Politicians promise. Engineers measure. Measurements don't care what people want to believe. That sounded exactly like Robert. Calm, practical, completely certain. His final request was surprisingly simple. Don't give these photographs to a lawyer first. Give them to an engineer. If the measurements are still changing, they'll know what to do. The next morning, I drove back to the property before sunrise. This time, I wasn't interested in the porch or the camera marker. I walked directly behind the retaining wall to the old survey stake that appeared in every photograph. Finding it wasn't easy. Years of weeds had almost hidden it. When I cleared away the brush, I realized it wasn't an ordinary wooden stake at all. The lower section disappeared into a steel monument, driven deep into the ground. It was a permanent geodetic reference point. Designed never to move. Robert hadn't been comparing the wall to the house. He'd been comparing it to the one point everyone agreed should remain absolutely fixed. I called Walter immediately. I found the survey monument. He laughed softly. So Robert finally showed you. You knew about it? Of course. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I wanted to know whether you'd discover it the same way he did. That afternoon I hired a licensed surveyor to take one modern measurement. 3 hours later, he closed his field notebook and looked at me. The wall has moved another inch. Since when? Since the last official survey. So it's still moving. He nodded. Slowly. But yes, Robert had been right all along. Over the following weeks, Walter, the surveyor, and I presented everything to the county engineering department. Not theories, not guesses, just evidence. 28 perfectly aligned Christmas photographs. Robert's handwritten notes, modern survey measurements, the permanent geodetic monument. For several minutes, nobody in the room spoke. Finally, the chief engineer looked at the album spread across the conference table. I expected old family photographs. He smiled quietly. I didn't expect 30 years of engineering documentation. Within 2 weeks, the county approved a full geotechnical investigation. Ground sensors were installed across the hillside. Engineers reopened the abandoned drainage galleries. Several had completely collapsed. Others were packed with decades of sediment, allowing groundwater to build pressure behind the retaining wall year after year. The wall wasn't about to fail tomorrow. But Robert had proven something even more important. It had never stopped moving. Without those photographs, nobody would have realized it until the damage became obvious. By then, repairs would have been far more expensive and far more dangerous. The stabilization project lasted more than a year. The drainage system was rebuilt. The retaining wall was reinforced from behind. When the work was finally complete, Walter stood beside me overlooking the river. "You know," he smiled. "Robert would have hated all this attention. I know. But he would have loved knowing the hillside is finally safe." Walter nodded. He finished the hard part. He just needed someone willing to look where everyone else was looking. The following Christmas, our family gathered on the porch again. Nobody suggested ending the tradition. Without saying a word, my cousin handed me Robert's old Pentax. The faded strip of tape marking the tripod height was still wrapped around one leg. I carried it outside, placed it over the brass marker labeled Camera Position A, adjusted the lens to 50 millimeters, centered the chimney exactly as Robert's notes instructed, and looked through the viewfinder. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my family. I was looking at the background. Then I smiled. Because I finally understood what Uncle Robert had been seeing for 28 Christmases. I pressed the shutter. One photograph. Just one. When I slipped it into a new album later that evening, I wrote a single line inside the cover. Year 29. Not because the tradition belonged to me now. Because some responsibilities don't end when the person who started them is gone. Sometimes they're quietly handed to the one person willing to keep watching.